Hi, I'm Evan B. Howard, and welcome to what we call in Montrose the Adobe Hills. We are here at the Adobe Hills of Montrose to offer you a video on solitude and retreat. I was not quite sure what to title this lecture. On the one hand, I want to address a couple of misconceptions that people have about the history of desert spirituality. But I don't want this to be simply a lecture about history. I actually have something to say about our practice today. So in some ways, it's a lecture about monasticism, but on the other hand, it's a lecture about contemporary spirituality. So in the end, I just borrowed most of the title from a 30-page essay that I wrote, and I published it on my website called Getting Away to It All. And if you're interested in digging a little deeper into this topic, I recommend that you look at this essay. The reason for my title is this. I think that we misunderstand the potential of solitude when we think of it simply as getting away from it all. I mean, I know we love those tranquil, peaceful retreats in the country, and I'm all for peaceful retreats, to a point. The fact is, I think when this is the only way that we look at solitude, we are missing something. Actually, we are missing some things, plural. The getting away from it all model of solitude is neither historically accurate nor spiritually powerful enough. So in this lecture, I want to set the record straight on both of these accounts, the historical and the practical. So, with regard to history, and particularly the history of what we call the desert tradition of Christian spirituality, there are a couple of misconceptions that I want to clear up. The first is that early monasticism, around the 4th century, was primarily a movement of flight into isolation within the desert. The technical term that we discuss in the history of desert monasticism is called withdrawal. A fairly literal translation of the Greek word anachoresis, from which we get the term anchorite, used to describe those early monks who lived alone. Athanasius' Life of Antony popularized the perception that early Christian monasticism had its origins in a movement of individuals who chose to withdraw into the desert to live a life of solitude. And yes, as a matter of fact, in various seasons of his life, Antony did indeed choose to live in a remote cave in a very remote desert of Egypt. When I was at Antony's cave last year, I took a shot of the horizon from the site just to give you a sense of how desolate and how remote it was. And as you can tell, at least some of his life was spent alone in a remote desert indeed. But the anchorites were by no means only or even the main expression of early monasticism. Pachomius, the founder of the model cenobitic or community monasticism, actually withdrew from the desert of his early training into the vicinity of the villages of the Nile River Valley. Many monks lived together in the early Pachomian monastic dormitories. Thus, Pachomian monasticism was neither desert nor was it solitary. The monastic communities of the lower Nile region, around Scetis or Kelia or Nitria, were neither arranged as isolated hermitages, nor were they in community dorms like Pachomius. But rather, they were organized as a cluster of individual cells surrounding or nearby a common center, as this shot of the remains of the establishment at Kelia indicate. The Lausaic history of Palladius and other sources make it clear that early monasticism was not simply a movement of retreat into the desert, but was a fundamentally diverse phenomenon. And yet the notions of withdrawal and desert stuck. They became symbols for something very basic to the monastic impulse throughout the Christian history. Celtic Christians withdrew to islands, like this tidal island off of Holy Island in northeast England. Or other out-of-the-way corners for seasons of solitude. Francis of Assisi and his partners, like Brother Rufino, holed up for their private Lents in caves along hillsides in Assisi, or near Assisi, that is. Young Catherine of Siena, in the 14th century, withdrew to her bedroom, practicing a life of penance and prayer in the confines of her own home. Entire monastic orders, like the Carthusians and the Camaldolese communities, were established with an aim to recapture something of their sense of the mystique of desert withdrawal. So, just what is monastic desert withdrawal, then, if it demands neither a desert nor permanent isolation? I think that Robert Sienkiewicz puts it well when summarizing 4th century spiritual writer Evagrius of Pontus's The Foundations of Monastic Life. He writes, "The fundamental requirement for acquiring a state of stillness in one's life is the withdrawal from all circumstances that give rise to anxieties, worries, and concerns." You see, solitude, retreat, withdrawal is not simply a matter of place, but it's actually a condition of life. Authentic retreat is not just about finding that mountain getaway, like this spot where I take my own retreats each month in Ouray, Colorado. It is about the elimination of the factors of our lives that interfere with the wholehearted pursuit of Christ and the gospel life. True, at times the desert or the mountain getaway may help facilitate our wholehearted presence to God. But let's not mistake the form for the essence. It is the clutter of our lifestyles that is most profoundly addressed in authentic withdrawal. The second misconception about desert withdrawal has to do with the term away. You see, it is the job of historians to explain things. And one of the things the historians felt like they had to explain was this exodus of Christians in the 4th century to the deserts of Egypt. Why this relocation? Why this isolation? Why the origins of Christian monasticism? Now, all of these are good questions insofar as they describe that portion of the movement which did withdraw into the desert. My problem is that these historians simply get their answers wrong. They point to changes that are not the central changes. For example, they describe taxation and conscription, and they suggest that many left to avoid harsh Roman regulations. Others suggest that the rise of monasticism was due to an influx of people seeking to flee the horrors of persecution. Still others argue that the monastic impulse was a reaction to a shallow post-Constantinian Christendom. Each of these suggestions argues that the early monastic impulse was some kind of getting away. They all offer some insight to some of the social factors surrounding the rise of early monasticism, but in my opinion, they are entirely inadequate as explanations of the actual experiences of the nuns and monks of the period themselves. For that, we must turn to the early monastic literature itself. And when we do so, we find an entirely different set of motives driving early monastic withdrawal. Early monastic withdrawal was about obedience to God or the scriptures and the call of God. Antony, for example, was about 20 years old when his parents died. And the transition after their death it was difficult. He had lived a relative life of affluence, and now he was alone, responsible for the care of his young sister. One Sunday, he goes to church as usual, and on his way, he was thinking about the early followers of Jesus, how many of them had sold everything they owned, and they placed the proceeds at the apostles' feet to distribute to those who had need. That very morning, he is standing in church, and the gospel reading is from Luke 18. "If you wish to be perfect," Antony heard, "go, sell what you possess, give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven." It was as if by God's design that Antony had been thinking about these early followers of Jesus just prior to this passage read. It was as if God was reading this passage just for him, and he couldn't ignore it. He immediately went out and sold nearly all of his possessions, keeping a few things for the care of his sister and donating the rest to the poor. And that was the beginning of Antony's journey. Many early religious following Antony were drawn by Scripture or by the call of the Spirit into their own commitments into this kind of lifestyle. For others, withdrawal was not so much a response to God or God's call, but rather it was a means of pursuing God. It was not just a matter of withdrawing from responsibilities or distractions, but it was rather a way of forming a life that best facilitated a full openness to pursue toward God. Other early monastics described their interests in terms of an imitation to Christ or the gospel message. Many were similarly impressed by their need to follow Christ in poverty, in singleness, total devotion of life. As William Harmless writes about the early Pacomian communities, he quotes, "They saw themselves not simply as pioneers of monasticism, but as pioneers in the art of Christian living, called to resurrect the New Testament's most radical vision of human community." Finally, many monastic seekers saw themselves as preparing for the eschaton, for an angelic life, a taste of heaven lived in the present of their own lives as individuals or communities. Withdrawal was not simply an environment of tranquil solitude, but rather it was the battleground, like Jesus experienced in the wilderness, where you were free from all the distractions of the world to face your own demons head on. Thus, solitude, retreat, withdrawal, was not necessarily a comfortable, tranquil time away from it all. Oh no. Retreat is an intentional, what I call getting away to it all. Do you see where I'm going? So then, what does all this mean for our practice of solitude today? I told you I had something to say about our practice today. First, the place of solitude is not as important as our posture of solitude. We do not need to go far, far away in order to pursue relationship with God. My wife, for example, following the lead of Jesus, likes to go on walks to be with God. Not too far, but far enough. I have a friend here in Montrose who transformed her closet in her house into a little prayer room. She literally goes into her closet to pray. Another of my friends has a favorite chair. Just sitting in this chair brings him in a mood to be with God. City or country matters not. You can be out here remote in the adobes, or you can be in the middle of an urban ghetto. What matters is that you find your own way to rid yourself of distractions in order to be present with and to follow God. This is retreat at its best. Nonetheless, having said this, I want to urge you to establish some practice, some rhythm, some kind of habit of solitude in your lives. It is easy in our urge to accomplish something to interpret retreat as an extracurricular addendum to our spiritual program. And again, this is a misunderstanding of solitude. It is not simply a time to get away from, but rather it is a critical pursuit of God, a getting away to. There are some who give early desert withdrawal a social interpretation, claiming that the move to the desert was a move to the fringes of the Roman Empire, where people had the freedom to explore and to create alternative expressions outside the boundaries of the system. Well, sure. Now, I think that religious life has this function of being an alternative culture. In another video, I will address that issue. But I have seen too many young new monastic expressions suffer from too much activity in the streets and not enough activity in solitude. Remember again, solitude is not simply getting away from. It is in withdrawal that I look straight into the violence in my own heart. I look at my own addiction to comfort, to convenience, to security. We fight the world on the streets best when we have fought it in solitude first. I know of some new monastic expressions located in conditions of global poverty that require their participants to have regular retreats away. A powerful away too that empowers them to serve from the fullness of the Spirit of God. This is where I go most of the time, to be alone and present with God. I dug this cell out of the side of the hill a long time ago because I thought it would make a neat fort. And then, in time, I discovered that it is here, in this location, early in the morning, that I find myself, most clearly myself, in the presence of God. And when I am with God in my cell, I become myself. And as I soak myself with God in the cell, I leave more myself, and I am better able to go out and to love others more clearly like Christ. So then, this is solitude at its best. Getting away to it all. Got it? Would you like to try it? I hope you do. And if you want more information, be sure and check out the website. Look for Getting Away to It All. And in the meantime, I hope you have a wonderful day.